Hello everybody, in this video I'm editing a student's sprite to try and give it a little bit more readability. Right, so this sprite is from a design student that I interacted with some time ago, and this is probably one of the best sprites that I've seen a student do in terms of mixing the concept design, the execution of the pixel art, but mostly the color palette is really terrific in this example. There's a very interesting contrast between the oranges and purples, which are complementaries, but the designer was smart enough to keep the oranges saturated while the purple is slightly more desaturated. There's a few exceptions, which are very clever. And for example, in the case of the, so these are all of the frames of the basic move animation. In the case of the walking up animation where you see the cloak, the colors actually, because they're alone, they actually look more saturated than they are. So that actually really the trade-off is really good. But one of the things is that in the front view especially, there's a lot of interesting details. And the tendency there is to then take those details and keep them in all of the views. And because the three-quarter view, in this case, this is a side view that's been done at a three-quarter, which is, again, very smart. There's a lot more detail in the three-quarter view than in the front view, even though that doesn't really make sense. But you have to think that you're seeing partial views of both front and side view. So there's not only the adding of detail, but also the sort of overlapping of detail. So in this situation, one of my suggestions would be to actually not bring so many of these details down into this format. So I singled out this frame just because I think it's probably one of the nicest illustrations. I would, take that leg, if I could just take this leg and do it like in a straight pose, and that would, for example, be like just a sprite that I would use to show in a screenshot or something. So what I want to do here is I want to sort of play around with mostly seeing if I can manage the detail so that there's a clearer read on the sprite. Now the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here on the workspace and I'm going to make a new window for this sprite in particular. And I'm going to have it docked to the right there. And I'll keep it very tiny. I just want it, I'll do twice the size. And then this one I'll be working mostly here. Now it doesn't update live, but once I've finished drawing something here, it'll show up on the other side. So what can we see, what can we learn from this image? So if I show my levels, you can see that most of my levels are basically on the lower part of the image. There's a few colors that are on the top part. So I'm looking probably at the beige creams and sort of the oranges. So that means that we can probably balance these out a little bit by either brightening up some of the darker areas or just increasing the amount of pixels that exist in the brighter areas. The other thing is I also can do is look at the histogram with the RGB values, or actually the color values, and you can see that despite the variation where you have the orange sitting in the high sort of values, because there's a lot of brown, you can also see that there's a pick in red on the sort of lower midtones. And so that means, again, that the palette is a little bit everywhere. So we could probably play with shifting the colors into more of a sort of saturated being a specific hue, and then less saturated being another hue. Still, what I can see that is most not distracting, but what's probably the thing that I would change the most is the amount of detail that exists. It's quite a lot of detail. Pixel art is a little bit faster to do than some other forms of game art, but it is still fairly time consuming, especially if you're doing multiple walk directions for a walk cycle. That can be extremely time consuming, more time consuming than doing something in 3D, which you can then animate and just get renders from different angles, or just use it straight up as a real-time model. So in this case, this would be the ideal place to optimize the amount of detail on the character while still keeping sort of the same visual language. So let's look at how the detail is distributed. Now, I'll give credit to the artist. The first thing I see when I look at this sprite is the face immediately. And that's because this is the higher area of contrast. And you don't have to trust me on that. You can actually test that out. If you just go to filters and you go to other and do high pass filter, Photoshop will try to match the bright and darks and bring them all into the same place. And you can see where the higher contrast exists because how Photoshop is forced to play with the values. So you can see that the arm, of course, there's a lot of contrast in the arm, but the face is probably one of the higher contrasts. Also the far arm and the tail. And the reason for that is that's where you find the most distinct brightnesses, right? White next to black, cream next to black, light gray next to mid dark gray, but also black. So all of these things sort of play together to create the impression of contrast. That's a very quick test. So let's try that again. See how there's like details here on the legs? What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in here and paint this just like this color. All of the legs, paint that flat color, right? So I'm not really changing the brightness all that much. Actually, this is not the correct direction of the legs. It should be the opposite. So let's do that instead. Right? So I'll just do that and we can see what happens. So if I do the same filter, those sort of spiky, noisy pixels are gone, of course, because I removed them, but also there's a lot less trying to match contrasts on the lower part of the legs. But if you look at the original sprite, you have the silhouette of the legs. That's enough in most cases to create the sense of silhouette of a character. But the advantage here is that it takes away from the interest of the legs. It makes us focus on the torso and head. And even then, the torso is also something that we can kind of like play a little bit. Now, moving on, we can do the same for the far arm, which I think is also quite detailed. And if you look again, if you look at what the filter does, there's a lot of detail there, right? So how we can do this is we can play with the lightness for the arm here. Can bring that down. I can also probably pick one of the darker gold colors to actually fill in on what the sleeve would be, and this highlight, we probably don't even need it. So let's look at what that looks like now with the filter, right? Way less. And I mean, you can either trust me or I could just actually do a little test. So I'm going to copy this whole part, copy, and then I'll undo, but I'll also undo the repaint that I did, right? And I'll paste that on top, and then I'll hide it, and I'll do the filter again on this so you can see what happened. This is what happened between one and the other. See the difference of just reducing the contrast in those areas? The only area that we weren't able to reduce the contrast was on the actual edge of the wrist, or the sort of the wrist decoration, because we kept the very dark pixels next to the fairly light shirt color. The problem here is that we have a yellow and a bluish gray. Let's just test that out. Yeah, it's a bluish gray. So the something in between would be an odd gray that I'm not sure we have. So how do we do that? We would have to get a, we would have to get something that would fit in between. Now, a lot of these grays are darker. This one is kind of okay, but it just doesn't have enough contrast to separate the two, right? So either we bring down the wrist as well, which kind of takes it out of the palette, but again, this kind of helps. I mean, I can just like quickly try and you can see the contrast is gone, but it doesn't really do much for me. Like, we could completely remove the outline and see if that works, but you would still, you'd now get a little different type of contrast. But I think overall, the insistence on using the dark outline, that should be the lead for us to use darker values in this part of the sprite anyway, right? So for example, here I could probably extend this up. On the outside, maybe I'd use that as well. And here, that's okay. That's kind of okay. I would try and find a darker gray, so something in between these two colors. I don't really have that much darker colors. I don't want to add too many colors, but I will have to add a couple of colors here. I don't want to use the brown because it'll go out of palette with the arm. So I'll take this color, do a 50% pass and place it here, and then I'll use that as my outline for the arm. And let's look at what that looks like now. So the contrast is almost gone in comparison, especially in comparison to the arm here on the right? And as far as looking at the shape, it's still there. It still reads. Actually, I need to get rid of this guy. So I'm going to go back to pencil. and get rid of this guy because it's just bringing it out a little too much. And maybe this could actually be in there. Anyway, now I'm at it. I'm doing art direction in the sprite. Should disagree. Now for the pose of the hands, and this is just a small anatomy change. For the pose of the hands, the legs feel like they are in different priorities. It feels like this leg here is near to the camera while this one is further away from the camera. It shouldn't be, since this arm is pointing forward. The far leg should be pointing back. So this should be the leg on the far side of the character, right? And maybe it is, but because the detail is so much, there's so much detail here, I'm having a hard time interpreting the sort of the perspective. So I'm going to force myself, or I'm going to paint in the perspective. Now I love these two colors, and to me those feel enough for now. So I'm going to paint the top of the leg in the brighter earth tone there, so something like that. Get rid of all the detail. I'll put it back if I feel like it has to exist. And then I'll do the same for the back leg, except the back leg probably shouldn't have the brighter tone. So I'm just going to take the dark one. I'll actually select all of these, and then with a sort of big brush, I'll go in and paint that. The same with this color. And then instead of using the dark tone as the this dark brown as a shadow, I'll just use the black that I have from the outline as a way to suggest overlap. And I'll just suggest overlap by like clothes folding, right? Like something like that. And maybe potentially there's a little line that goes over there where the sort of the, I don't know what these are, pants, sort of fold on top, or maybe we could do on the other side, or maybe we should just like do an additional fold here, or maybe here. It quite depends on the fit, especially, but I don't know. I feel like I should probably do that more on the on where the bend for the knee exists. So maybe something like that would make more sense. It's too long. Maybe that, just that would probably be enough to suggest that there's a fold there. The other thing is I probably want to extend this bright color up to the edge, and over here I do also want to extend this over to the edge as much as possible, and considering now whether or not I should do a little highlight for the boot. What is the boot like? What's the design for the boot? So that's something that I'd be interesting to figure out before you actually go in and shade. But for the purposes, I'll just do like a little sort of leathery kind of boot. But let's look at the original sprite and see what we have on our front view. So in the front view, we have some detail here on the thighs. So it feels like it's a little wrap of leather coming in. And from the boots, it feels like there's maybe a little trim at the top. So I'm going to try and add that as much as possible. So I'll just extend. Actually, the shape here is not too bad. I'll just pull this in, and the same here, right? And then maybe there's a little dip and a line, and that is enough to suggest, I feel, the top of a boot. You could probably add more detail to it. I'm not going to, because again, it's just going to draw attention to the boot, and it's not the center point for the character, I feel. Something like that. Maybe this can actually go. Here's an interesting suggestion. So if you draw this vertical line as a full black line, the edge becomes very vertical, very straight. But if I take this brown and paint it over, while you keep the same edge sort of straightness, the sprite now looks a little bit more rounded, because this is going to look brighter and sort of suggest that this is more like a heel rather than just a flat surface. And that's just a trick that you can use by just changing the color of the pixels on the outline. And there's a lot of that. Look, for example, here, I would probably keep this there and just do this here. Maybe even do this to suggest like an actual heel coming in. Maybe there's a little line that I could draw, right? And these are all things that don't change the shape, don't change the silhouette of your sprite, but they add sort of implied detail. It does feel like I'm adding too much detail, so I think I probably should play low with this. I would want to have a lighter color than this, but darker than this. So maybe there's something out there that I could use. This is the same hue. This is the same color. Damn. Is this the same color? No, this is a good replacement. Depends on whether or not this is at the tip. If this was at the tip, probably be more like this, and it would take this brown and do that. So that would make more sense, right? So let's clean this silhouette up a little bit now that I kind of decided what my boot looks like. And so I'll just do that. And maybe I'll do the same here with a little suggestion of a curve for the boot lip. And then now this line can actually just exist that way, and it becomes the boot detail, right? The other thing is, because the sprite is 3/4, I actually think that the back foot is very long, because you have to think of where they meet the body. They should be meeting the body up here, which means that this one is meeting the body up there while the knee is still down here. So that's a very long femur bone. So what I'm going to do is take this and I'll move it to the left. Now it's probably going to ruin the tail, but I'll play with it later. I'll sort of fix it later. So do that, move it over. And because I'm moving it over, I'm also getting suggestions that the perspective now may be a little bit off. So I'll do a little change here on this line just to suggest that it's curving a little bit more, that I'm seeing this shape more from the front rather than from the side. Right, it's a very tiny change, but I think it helps. So I'll paint that in the deep red for the tail. Also, I think now the tail might look a little bit long. There's a little bit of tangents here that I don't like. Actually feel like the tail shouldn't be that dark in this area, so I'll just use this brown as well as a way to sort of transition it back into the sort of the dark tone. I don't know what the tail situation looks like as it connects to the body, so I'm just gonna like fade it into black, and hopefully people will solve that in their own minds so I don't have to make any assumptions or, you know, make any decision calls. Same thing for this leg, probably bring it back a little, add some of those dark brown colors in there just for silhouette and for aliasing. And that, I think, made it look a little bit slimmer. The other thing I like is the far limb. I also like to always put it a couple of pixels higher, or just a couple of pixels, you know, shifted, something like that or that. I think it'll help sort of convey that it's further away. If you're looking at sprite from a certain angle, it would probably mean that you are standing up with the camera, so you're looking down at the feet, and the feet would actually be sort of at a different plane. I still move it up once or one more. I think it looks better this way. Okay. Yeah. So let's do the filter again. Contrast is nearly gone, right? But we do still have information. Now, there's the issue of keeping the detail, the pattern that we had. And as far as I can understand, this is something that's coming in from the side, and that's probably causing some little changes. And then I'll go in and try to suggest something there with some of these lines that I've already created now. But again, I'm still within a very restricted palette. It's 3 colors so far for all these details. Let's take a look at what those look like again. There's a strap at the front, or something that connects the two at the front. So while I don't want that strap to look bright, what I can do is I can paint a shadow for it that is fairly dark, and that will suggest that the strap itself is brighter. And that might not mean much in terms of sort of what the shapes are, but I think it helps convey detail that doesn't exist. So let's look at the contrasting. There's a little bit there, but I think we're still pretty much within the reasonable values. And this one, again, I'll just add another little darker line there to again suggest that something else is happening in terms of detail without going into detail. Right, so let's move up to the torso. So the hand here, I'm having some difficulties with this thumb, so I'm going to flatten that out in terms of color. And I think I'm going to try and suggest a thumb with this light brown, just by sort of extending it over here, or maybe actually just trimming the rest of it. And maybe taking that color and lighting it up. And maybe there's some darker value that I can use here to sort of fold. Yeah, that feels to me like it's more like a glove wrapped around. And again, I just wish I could have like another color here. Maybe there is a dark gold color that I could use, because I really like the colors here. I just don't think that we should have bright shades everywhere on the sprite. Because the arm is going towards the far end of the sprite, the torso should also sort of be going towards the far end of the sprite. So all of the gold color that I have on this side, I'm actually going to paint it all with the darker tone of gold that I can find, which I think is this one. So I'm just going to go in with a big brush and just fill that in the darker areas. Or sorry, the further away areas. And I still think it's too bright, so I'm going to take this color and actually use that as my gold for some of these, right? So for example, the buckle belt, so the belt buckle actually. There's an interesting E there. I don't know if that means anything specifically for the students project, but I'll keep it as an E. But it is very it draws a lot of attention to it. It feels like is there a message in there? Is that a specific thing? And so I don't want to go in and like put highlights on it because it's just going to draw even more attention to it. And it's kind of exactly the opposite I want to do. So in the front view, you can see that there's like a sash around it. I feel like it's more of a belt, but the red line here, even though it's providing it with the color, I think it's making it look very, very thick, right? And so I think in this situation, probably I would do like this kind of outline. Whoops. Leave the black one for the bottom because that's now a cast shadow. And I would probably not use this red. I would use maybe that red, yeah, but like in a percentage, like 40%, but I would paint the whole thing with that color. All right, so that way we can have the darker version here for when it sort of wraps around into the body like that. And we could probably even do the same here for the belt buckle so that there's not so much contrast where there's like dark values, right? So that way we can actually now take and do like something like that, or maybe that. I don't know what's happening really with the belt buckle because maybe there's a design that I don't have. But I think this sort of draws attention away from it a little bit more. You can have parts of your image that draw attention to themselves, but you shouldn't have all parts of your image draw attention to themselves because then you're just fighting with noise. Right, so let's see what that looks like. Yeah, a complete drop in contrast, both in the arm and a little bit there. So here is the same issue. The gold trim on this vest, I mean, it does look nice, but I think it's a little too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and find places where I can actually use the original orange color as a highlight, like there, for example, as a highlight to convey the feeling of gold rather than just as the base color for it. Right? So for example, the top here of the cloak, there's definitely going to be a highlight there for sure, right? And because it's going to be very bright and shiny, I don't think I'm going to use the actual thickness that the designer put here. So I'm just going to use 1 pixel width of line, and then I'll just go and take some of these bright colors. Actually, that was already the bright one, and do a couple of highlight pixels there. And I'll take the dark one and use that. Wait, so dark, bright. So this one. I'll use this one to sort of make the cloak fade into the back, but also because it's going to keep it from clashing with this glove, with this sort of wrist detail. Like there's more colors here than the ones that I'm using. Yeah, in this situation, I would probably actually just go in and full on do a white highlight there, just for the sake that it's shiny, right? And we'll do the same here at the cloak at the top. Now, the lack of outline here is a little concerning. I would probably do that. Same thing here. I would take actually this, keep this as a highlight there from the top part, just to sort of make it a little bit more shiny and roundy, rather than just have it be sort of a flat surface, which I understand it should be because it's kind of like a cuff, but I think it works better if it draws enough attention to it as the hand moves. I will change one thing in this hand, which is that, and I think it looks perfect. It provides me with the suggestion that this is a sort of a gloveless, a fingerless glove, or maybe that actually would help, or maybe just make that like that. It just gives me that suggestion that it's a fingerless glove, which I quite like. Not sure if it should be orange like the rest of the fur, but I'm guessing now that this is like human body. The little knife here, you can see that it stands out, and I quite like that it stands out because it's a very interesting detail. But I think this looks fairly flat, and I can't find a brighter shade to put in that isn't something like gold or you know. So what I'll do instead is I'll darken everything down like that, and then I'll bring in one of these sort of dark browns. Actually, that's too dark. Something like this to add it a little bit more volume. Having more volume, more shades brings more attention to it. Maybe this doesn't need to exist like that. I'll also keep the dark outline at the top of the knife because, again, it just uses that contrast to push the the handle a little bit more into the viewer's perception. No, I think that looks good. So the other big sort of culprit here is the arm. The arm is very contrasting, which is fine, but I think the contrast is quite high in a lot of these situations. So I'm going to pick this gray, which is a mid gray between the two, and I'll paint in the areas where the gray just sort of behaves as a line on top of the sleeve. So what does that look like? A little bit better, right? And maybe we could do the same sort of transitioning shades even for anti-alias, because this is a big area in the image, and if we don't do a little softening in the silhouette of it, it's just going to generate contrast. And maybe we want contrast in some areas like this. This is way softer now, right? And again, here the issue is that it's a light gray next to a dark black, so we'll try and figure a way to sort of transition those smoothly by adding a little bit of anti-aliasing in there. And actually, personally, I think that the shadow should be extended a little bit more on there, and maybe now I need an additional dark tone, so I can use that purple. Shouldn't be mixing hues, but the reason we shouldn't be mixing hues usually in game sprites is because the game sprites will sometimes use a palette, and if you start using colors from a different part of the model in parts where there shouldn't be, which is not the same sort of material, if someone happens to change the color palette to have a different variation of color, you might get colors that you didn't expect in places that you didn't put them in. I think I'm actually going to move this strip here 1 pixel to the left because I think it helps establish the perspective a little bit more. Again, this is also fairly contrasting. I don't really know what's happening here, but I think it's the cloak sort of tying in at the front. I'm just going to like use sort of my own personal interpretation of it as a way to sort of clean it up a little bit more. This huge contrast here because of that dark pixel. So I think for the torso and legs, I think this almost there's already a lot that's been solved just by playing around with what colors to use in what parts. And I think that a lot of it also has to do with the fact that the design was already established. There's a color here, yeah, which is the same with the cloak. A lot of these colors were already established, and because of that, it's easy to sort of understand where to make changes. But would that not be the case, a lot of it would probably come down to intuition, to how an artist feels like something should be shaded, rather than following a logic of a design. This should be in shadow, so I'm going to actually take this, add it as an highlight, and then bring that in shadow, which is also going to make this suggest that it's in shadow as well. Let's take that color there. Yeah, so that's a nicer sort of highlight. This should have a longer shadow, considering it's sort of floating above the belt. I don't see how it's attached to the belt. Maybe something like that, but it's just, yeah, it's probably adding detail that's going to be distracting, so we'll just keep it like that. What else can we see? Let's look at the arm now, right? Softer. We still have contrast between the arm and the cloak, but I mean, it's really difficult to not have that. So what I can do is I can take these dark pixels and make them a little bit darker, sort of a little bit lighter, so that the contrast isn't as high, and we can also sort of transition into the gold a little bit by adding some anti-alias, suggestion of anti-alias. Here I can do a little bit of suggestion like I did with a heel, where I put additional brighter pixels to make it look like that bit is rounder. And if we look now, yeah, that disappeared a little bit. I also want to paint some colors here on the back of the cloak a little bit, and maybe get rid of some of these that are sort of loose, and then transition the gold all the way to the back. Again, I don't really know what's happening with the overall shape of the cloak. This suggests to me that this should be in shadow, so I'm going to tone it down a few shades. Let's look at the back view. Yeah, there seems to be a trim. Oh, I see what it is. I see what it is. Okay. So it's like a bit that goes over the shoulder and sort of wraps around the back. Okay. So the cloak's there, but there is something on top. Okay, so I think that I'm going to go back and add some of this detail here. And because I know now that this arm is kind of in the light, I can do that. And I can extend the cast shadow on this side as well. Okay, so that's 2 layers of cloak. That's kind of cool. And then I'll have this dark tone here at the back. Oh, that's already the same. Get rid of this pixel, maybe. Yeah. So as far as the face, there's really very little that I want to change. The only thing I would probably change is make sure that this outline is not that color. So it's like the dark purple. And that is pretty much all that this needs to be. I mean, well, maybe you can do this. Not that. Maybe a dark brown, because that's like too much saturation. Not that dark. Something like that. Just again to soften the transition between tones, because I think this is a little bit too much, a little too dark for objects that are so bright by default, right? And then what probably happens, and I'd bring in some of these oranges to sort of soften this up. Yeah, but it's a very interesting process to sort of take someone else's work and think about what you would change, with, of course, the intent to sort of improve or to make improvements to it. And because you get to work on something that already exists, a lot of decisions have already been made, which you can't change, so you have to play with what you have. I have added colors to this image because I think it'll help, but the reality is I think that the overall palette was already really good. So it's more an issue of like depth and perception of volume and perception of overlap rather than anything else. I'm not sure if I like the fact that this color is so flat, so I think I might find a darker shade of gray just for some points here. I know that I mentioned in the beginning that this shouldn't have so much detail because it'll make the artist's life simpler, and now I'm adding detail. But I think that the face, for example, is something that you could probably just copy, in a lot of situations, copy and paste for different frames, because it's not going to make any severe rotations, while the legs, they will rotate. They will rotate quite a lot, and they will move quite a lot. Sorry, so let's go back to get the original sprite, which I've already gotten rid of because I forgot to make a copy. So this is what we started with, and this is what we ended up with. So there's a lot of contrast lost here at the bottom, and I just made the pose a little bit clearer because I think it's more informative this way. This probably here needs to be darker, just so it doesn't pop in the front so much. And this line maybe should extend a little bit higher to suggest that the shoulder is actually up here. Now, it's totally fine if you think that this version looks nicer because there's more contrast, more colors, but I think that in terms of readability, you want to pick your battles and make sure that you invest your time in parts of the sort of the sprite that really are going to pay off in terms of readability and communication. I do want to have an outline here just because there's an outline on all the surfaces, and I just felt that this was missing out. The outline makes it look a little bit too thick, so maybe let's bring the outline in 1 pixel, see if that works. Probably not going to work. It's going to be a little too much, but maybe it does. And if it does, I think it'll be like a nice addition. So yeah, this I think is what we ended up with. Again, let's look at the differences. I didn't really change much of the identity of the sprite. It's really an issue of the shading style and adjusting the contrast, which I think helps in establishing a more clear focus point as the head rather than the whole body itself being a focus point. And yeah, that's it. I hope you guys enjoy this and that you learned something from it. And I'll do this call to anyone who has sprites that they feel that they could improve somehow. If you need pointers, send it over. If you're okay with me making a video describing what I would change to make the sprite better, just send me that stuff, put it in comments. I don't know how you would send me that, but like just I'll reach out if I want to. Just send me comments and I will try and turn those into videos, and maybe everyone can learn a little bit from that. So yeah, take care. And I'll see you some other time.